Greetings and blessings. Today, I want to bring your attention to a new corner of the solar system, the dwarf planets. And the reason that I find this very relevant is because each time we discover something new about the solar system and the universe, the science of it is fascinating, but it also represents, as we know, astrologers correlate what is going on in nature, what is going on in the sky, what is going on in the solar system with our own civilization and with the change of consciousness. So we cannot ignore this new phase of development that started pretty much in the year 2000, but the first trans-Neptunian object was actually discovered in 1992. I think it's still labeled in its numeric reference, QB1. And this was a very important discovery because they started to realize that it looked very similar to Pluto. And this brought to question whether there's more. 8 years later, they discovered a new one called Varuna, which was larger than 1992 QB1. And so a new phase began pretty much there. Where are they? Let's look at the solar system map and geography. We have the four rocky planets that are closest to the sun, including us, Earth. Then we have the asteroid belt, which is comprising of a multitude of rocks. None of them are necessarily round, except Ceres. They'll have all kinds of weird formation, look like debris. But there's an estimation that there are about 100,000 of them. And I'm going to do another video on the asteroid because it's another fascinating story. However, some of the main ones, the larger one, are well known to most astrologers. Juno, Pallas Athena, Hygeia, Vesta, and Ceres until recently. I say until recently because Ceres looks very much like a planet rather than the shape of an asteroid. And so they upgraded it to the status of a dwarf planet. More on that coming. And so soon after, right after that, we have the four gas giants. So we have four rocky planets, asteroid belt, four gas giants, Jupiter to Neptune. And Pluto used to be the ninth planet until they started to see these new bodies that brought a lot of question. And it wasn't until they found an asteroid named Eris that the debate really got a lot of traction, and the change, followed very quickly after that. So we're going to talk a lot about these bodies that are essentially called trans-Neptunian planets beyond Neptune, and they are mostly in what we refer to as the Kuiper belt, which is another band similar to the asteroid belt that contains a lot of icy bodies. And so now Pluto is considered trans-Neptunian. dwarf planet. So trans-Neptunian is a larger term that includes a lot of these bodies, whereas the dwarf planets are larger. They are the more massive among them, and they're also round. So they actually are round like a planet because their orbit allows them to be. Among them, Pluto, Eris, and then also Haumea and Makemake. There is another extremely important object that was discovered in the same time frame around the early 2000s, 2003, Sedna. Sedna is a candidate to be a dwarf planet, but there isn't enough photograph or evidence to confirm it as such. So most astronomers believe it is, but they just need, the due process, so to speak. And there are a few, like Sedna, who are waiting to be confirmed as dwarf planets. Now, understand that when we have these discoveries, it happens at a time where that is reflected in our own civilization. For example, when they made the first discovery of a planet, once they invented telescopes, Uranus was the first planet to be discovered that was not visible to the naked eye. And even though Uranus has always been influential, whether we know it or not, doesn't mean it's not having its own astrological impact. But the time that Uranus came to our consciousness and we named it, and it was a fact, coincided with very Uranian type activities and movements and civilization development. For example, this was the time of the Industrial Revolution. What is more Uranian than the Industrial Revolution and the steam engine invention that catalyzed so much progress, so much change, and the urbanization? And what Uranus represents is technology, machinery, speeding things up. Now, if we have a series of new discoveries in the early 2000s, and I said the first sign was in 1992, but then the second more significant one was Varuna, and then Sedna and Eris. This means something for our own civilization, for our own consciousness. So there's something extraordinary happening on a scientific level, on an astronomy level. But we as astrologers translate that as well to what does that mean for our consciousness? And what are these times about? What's going on? So I have a whole video that you can watch on the discovery of Pluto. And this is very informative because it tells you what is in a name. These astronomers are not necessarily spiritual people. Maybe they are, but it's not a requirement. And yet they come up with names through sometimes questioning the public, through sometimes internal dialogue. And there are usually several suggestions. And there's one name that sticks. That's one name that is actually representing that planet. And for us astrologers, even though it seems completely random, There is a lot in that name. It's usually referring to a deity, some mythological figure that captures an archetype, captures something very important for our own uh, meaning and understanding. So even though for the astronomers it's just a label and it's a name, for us, it opens a whole new door to deeper understanding. So most all of the previous names to the planets were Greco-Romans. We have mostly the Roman names, Neptune is Poseidon, and Saturn is Cronus, and Mercury is Hermes. So these gods were converted to a Roman version, which we adopted. But the mythology is the same in the Roman and the Greek mythology for the most part. And I want to say that for us astrologers, it's a starting point. It's not the end point. So we begin with exploring the myth. And we know that the planets are also associated with a sign. So Jupiter is Sagittarius and Mercury is Virgo and Gemini. So it's easier for us to understand and to deepen and expand our understanding and meaning of the planet because we have more material to work with. But when we have completely new bodies, how do we even begin to derive meaning from there? We begin with the name. We begin with why was this name chosen for this planet? Again, go back to the Pluto, discovery of Pluto video. There's a treasure trove there of amazing synchronicities. So what is very interesting with these dwarf planets is that they are named for the first time after non-Greco-Roman myths. Varuna is of Indian origin. Let me get to this particular slide here. So Varuna is 280-year cycle. It's a Hindu god. And then Quaoar, 2002, almost similar orbit, 286, is a Native American deity of creation, particularly from Southern California tribe, the Tongva. Then Haumea, 284 years orbit, is after a Hawaiian fertility goddess, the mother of the Hawaiian pantheon. Then Makemake is named after a Easter Island Rapa Nui god of fertility and eggs. They still went back to the Greco-Roman for some of them, namely Eris, who is the goddess of discord and controversy, which we're going to really explore, and Ixion, also Greco-Roman. And then Sedna, we're going to talk about Sedna considerably now. She's also from the indigenous native tribes of Alaska and also North Canada, Arctic Canada, and Greenland. So she is basically honored and part of the Eskimo Inuit culture. Now, you may ask, is there space in our chart for more bodies. How how do we manage? It's already hard to synthesize the 9 planets and the moon. And then there are asteroids and there are centaurs. And now we have this whole new category of dwarf planets. And as you notice, they are all beyond Pluto. Pluto is the closest one, pretty much. Ixion and Pluto are very close to one another. And then Haumea, Quaoar, Makemake, and Varuna are pretty close after that. And then Eris and Gonggong from China are about double the distance from Pluto. And Sedna is its own other category with 11,000-year orbit. Get that? I'm repeating. We're jumping from 500-year orbit to 11,400. That's quite the leap. But that is why there's a revelation here. There's something that is a message for humanity. So how do we do this? It's very hard to research these planets because they move so slow. And because they move so slow, you cannot make a distinction between one day or the next. You have to watch them over a long period of time. So we don't have yet so much distance since they were discovered. But we're starting. Many astrologers are doing extensive research. There are books being written on them. And so we need to pay attention to them. So how do we make sense of so many things in our chart? Keep in mind that there are ways to understand how to use them that won't confuse you. That you don't need to always include them in every chart. So that's the first thing. You can still refer to the main 9 planets, including Pluto, as your core principle, as the fundamental archetypes. And even though Pluto was demoted to or reclassified, demoted is not the right word. Pluto likes to be small. And part of the message of Pluto is that I'm tiny and I'm far away, but I come with tremendous power. So the distance and the size doesn't diminish its importance and influence. So whether it's called dwarf or not, it's really only an astronomical reference. But for us astrologers, that opens a door to a new understanding. As far as the importance of Pluto, as far as its leadership and rulership of Scorpio, to me, that hasn't changed because it's we work with that every day and it works. So be patient, take a deep breath, and come with an open mind, because what seems to be foreign and overwhelming is usually because it's new and misunderstood. I want to invite you to the conference at Omega, upstate New York, where I'm going to have a special session on dwarf planets, and particularly Haumea, Eris, and Sedna, and Quaoar. So we're going to touch on them here, and it's going to give you already a glimpse and food for thought and an opportunity to learn more about them. But at the conference, I'm going to unpack this with more examples and more extensive research because there's so much material. Now, this is not going to be recorded, so you have to come in order to participate in that. And what's not to like? It's in the forest, upstate, in the fall foliage of the northeast of the United States. And it's incredibly beautiful. It's a small, relatively small group for a conference, and we celebrate with activities, with community. You see a harp player, Cheryl, and we study by the lake. So it's really high quality boutique conference immersion where you make new friends, where you speak your own language of astrology. You come out of your closet, so to speak. And it's about a couple of hours from New York City. There are trains that take you there. It's quite accessible. So consider that. The faculty luminaries, some of the more enlightening voices of astrology. So there is also a video available on Ixion. I'm not going to touch on Ixion today. I just want to make a reference to it so there's some material, at least introductory material, available on this channel. And there's also a full 1-hour workshop on Ixion, if you dare, because Ixion, he's quite the character. If you want to find the article on the dwarf planet, go to article on my website, mauricefernandez.com, and you will see here a selection: building blocks, great cycle, practice, astrology library, international article, different languages. So the one on the dwarf planet is right here in the first row. It may move, but that's where it is now. And enjoy. There's a lot in here that will not make it to this video, so it's additional information. I'm going to start with Sedna. Sedna, with its incredibly long orbit, is probably the most interesting and the one that really breaks our boxes completely open. So Sedna spends a different amount of time in each sign. Its nodes are North node at 25 Leo and South node at 25 Aquarius. And that's important because if you have planets on those degrees, they immediately have a Sedna quality to them. This planet will be flavored by the influence of Sedna. So what is the story of Sedna? Let's look at the astronomy first. This is the orbit. You see it right. The purple circle here is the solar system. And then there's Sedna. She has this intensely eccentric orbit, elliptical, where she comes close to the solar system and then stretches out for years and years into nowhere land, into the far reaches of the cosmos. And that what make this particular dwarf planet, planetoid, trans-Neptunian object so fascinating, because she's bringing knowledge, she's bringing energy from those far reaches of the solar system and the cosmos back to where we are. So she's bridging us to another world. And that means new revelation, new understanding, both on a science level and on a psychological, spiritual level. Now, she's named after an Inuit goddess, as I mentioned, from Alaska and Arctic Canada and Greenland, which is obviously referring to these lands where very few of us are living. So part of these far-reaching places. That's, I believe, the reasoning that led to the naming. And I traveled to Alaska this year to do some research on Sedna and watch some bears. And I'm going to show you something interesting. As I booked my flight to Alaska earlier this year, Sedna is now by transit at 0 degrees Gemini. And the time that I actually booked, I was debating whether I will go, whether I have time, whether it's suspicious. And yeah, I decided to eventually do it. I had a friend who invited me, and it was an opportunity. So that's my progress moon when I booked that ticket at 0 Gemini, right on Sedna. Can't make this up. I'm going to Alaska, and that's the transit. And Sedna is basically telling me, I have some Gemini information for you. Come on over. And so I did. So when you look at her orbit, you see that when she's close to the Earth, close to the inner solar system, she's going to travel much faster. And that's when they discovered her. They discovered her when she was close, relatively close to us. Because once she's out in the woods of the cosmos, in the oceans of the cosmos, it's hard to track her. It's hard to see her. So we were privileged to see, that she presented herself to us during this time. And this is why she spends a different amount of time in each. I'm going to close my window so you can see everything. She spends a different amount of time in each sign. So she's going to be in Gemini only 42 years, which is a lot for a planet. Pluto's staying 36-year maximum in a sign. And so her minimum is greater than what we knew to be the maximum. But listen to this and hear this and read this. She spent 1,080 years in Capricorn. And before that, she spent another 1,000+ years in Sagittarius. So she's very fast in Gemini Cancer and very slow in Sag Capricorn. And then gradually, she started to speed up. She stayed almost half the time in Aquarius, and then half the time in Pisces, and half the time in Aries. And here we are. Now, when you look at these periods of time, there were massive, important events to our civilization. I mean, when a planet stays 1,000 years in a sign, it's going to impact on very global issues. And when we have her in our chart, we see how we personally can be agents of these global issues. So when she moved to Capricorn was the beginning, the emergence of the Roman Empire, which led to the Eastern and Western Roman Empire that eventually dissolved, but created, structure and governance and art and civilization. This was also the time of Jesus. Jesus was born roughly before 7 to 10 years BC. So he is also part of that movement ingress of Sedna into Capricorn. And Capricorn, you see Jesus nailed on the cross of matter, persecuted by the regime, by the Romans, and by the local zeitgeist. So his message was a message that ended up being very relevant for the next 2,000 years, where Christianity spread across the planet for better and worse. But there is something to be said about a new, prophetic figure. Now, if you go prior to that, what were the civilizations of Sedna in Sagittarius? You had the Greek, the Hellenistic period, with all the philosophers, the Socrates and the Plato and the Aristotle, the mathematicians, who were all into these higher spheres of philosophy and democracy and sciences that relate to Sagittarius, which we today still, refer to and quote. And then you had ancient Egypt and the Hebrews, who also each brought, a canon of knowledge and wisdom and philosophies. So fascinating. Now, if you move into time, I'm going to unpack this with greater detail at the conference, but I'm offering you here already some of the gold nuggets. Think about the fact that when Sedna was in Pisces, that is when the first ship from Africa came to the United States. The first ship was slightly before that, in 1619, the first ship to come to the United States. But slavery was already ongoing, in the Arab world and in Europe. And yet, when Sedna moved into Pisces, this era of slavery, particularly in the United States, was immensely wounding. And Pisces represents slavery, not only the passage through the water, crossing the oceans, but it has to do with taking people's agency, making them invisible. Pisces is the invisibility, both as a power and as a victimization. And yet, at the same time, we see that the slaves were used to build the country. They were free labor, cheap labor that helped contribute to the building of this new civilization. And you see that as Sedna moves into the sign of Eris, 1864-65, and I'm using several years because it takes a while for this extremely slow-moving planet to actually ingress into a new sign. It moves into the new sign, that retrogrades back into the old sign, and then moves back. So there's a period of transition that extends at least 2-3 years, if not more. But 1864-65 is when Lincoln created the emancipation, freedom for the slave following the Civil War. So isn't that amazing that when Sedna moves into Aries, the sign of freedom, the sign of who am I exist, coming out of this effacement, from this invisibility into, yes, you are. Yes, you have rights. Yes, you exist, and you have a role in our society. So this tells us already that Sedna means business, and we need to pay attention to her movements because they coincide with historical development, both on the challenging side and the rewarding side. So who is Sedna? A very intense myth. As I mentioned, she's an Inuit goddess. And the story begins that she lives with her father in the Arctic. Her mother died, and so she takes care of her father, but she's not married, and her father wants her to marry. So he's ambivalent because on the one hand, he needs her, but he wants her to marry. And she refuses all the suitors. She's dreaming about someone who's really noble and has all the, warrior qualities and alpha male and ethical. And so she's basically not rushing to get married. And someday a suitor come from faraway lands in the Arctic and says, I want to marry you. I've heard of how beautiful you are, and I'm here to ask you to be my wife. And there are different variation and version to the myth, but whether it's the father that, kind of pressures her to marry him, or whether she eventually is seduced by his promises, she eventually leaves her dad and goes to these, other area that is quite distant and starts her new life as his wife. And then she realizes at some point that he is not a human, but he's a bird. He's a spirit. And she feels cheated. She feels deceived that he hid his true identity. And he's not really the one who can support her, who can fulfill the promises he made. So she laments, and eventually, in one way or another, her father hears her call and he comes to fetch her. So she escapes with her father. And eventually, the Birdman finds out, and he's an impressive bird with a long and vast wingspan, and he flaps his wings so much so that it creates waves and wind and a storm that risks basically crashing the canoe that she and her father are on. And her father panics, and he feels like he offended the gods, he offended him, and he throws Sedna back to the water. Is basically telling her, you go back to the Birdman. And she doesn't want to. She holds her grip, holds her hands on the canoe, and her father hits her hands, and he severs her fingers. Very, very dark story. And the Inuit, say there are even more intense side to the myth, but it's a powerful myth because, yes, she drowns, she loses her fingers, who each become sea mammals, particularly seals, but also all the other marine life. And so she loses her grip. Very important. She has no fingers. and she drowns, and they, the fingers become themselves beings, and she becomes the goddess of the seas. Now, if you spend time in the Arctic, you know that the sea is the source of life. This is where all the food comes from. It's what sustains Arctic communities. So for Inuit people, the goddess of the sea is of high importance. And so she is revered as this powerful goddess who can help them fish and find food, or she can starve them. So because she loses her fingers, she cannot comb her hair. So you see this depiction here of this art that shows her hair, which is becoming very symbolic, because in order to appease her anger, you need to comb her hair. And then, she becomes benevolent and graceful. So that kind of power, but feeling that she needs help, is very symbolic. The loss of control that makes someone very vulnerable, even as a goddess. So the symbol derives from the script in the local culture to write her name. And that's how it looks like. It looks like this kind of Saturn shape with a circle in it. Now, Sedna brings something completely foreign from the distant land, from the depth of the ocean, something that can change humanity. But as they discovered Sedna, they found out there are other crazy objects like her. She's not even the one who goes the farthest out. There's another one named after a Hawaiian deity, Lelea Kuhonua, hopefully pronouncing that close enough, who goes even farther away. And so there may be a lot more, but we don't see them because we can only track them when they're close to the sun. So this has its own category, which are now referred to as sednoids. So sednoids are part of the trans-Neptunian, and they're part of the dwarf planets, probably. We're all in the early stages of these new understanding, both astrologically and astronomically. So what is fascinating as you hear this story, what is fascinating is that we are now, for the first time, incorporating deities that are not Greco-Roman. And this coincides with a return to indigenous wisdom. Up to this recent history, indigenous cultures were quite often considered savages. And we all heard the horror stories of colonialism and how local indigenous culture could not speak their own language, had to be converted and were shamed for their practices. And now that all these planets are named after indigenous cultures, there is a revival and a recognition, a validation that they are not savages. They are much closer to nature and have a different way of learning. If you go to Aboriginal Australia, if you go to Hawaii, if you go to Native American on, North America, you realize how much depth and understanding of star systems, of seasons, and the communication with nature is teaching us to be part of nature rather than above nature. So the anthropocentric model of Western civilization, of us dominating nature, is very different from the inclusive, circular position of many indigenous culture who lived as part of nature. So what came first, was the revival of these indigenous culture inspiring the astronomers to, name and learn about these myths and name the planets after them, or, it just happened synchronistically. It doesn't matter. What matters is that it's happening, and that this tells us of a new era that brings this ancient wisdom back to front and center. This makes it a little harder for us astrologers to research these bodies. Not only are they very small, excuse me, not only are they very distant and slow moving, they're also not connected to one another. And so we have to kind of start gathering data and knowledge and impact very slowly and gradually. But more and more material is now available. There are books on Ixion and Eris, and so even though it's early stages, it is starting to emerge in our astrologers' world. Interestingly, the discovery of Sedna occurs with Sedna on the north node of the moon. You see that it's opposite the sun, which is usually when you find planets, because when they're opposite the sun, they're closer to Earth and they're closer to sea. So what you see here is how Sedna is also opposing the sun, which is the father. And you see this whole dichotomy of the father, the patriarchal figure, and how he betrays her and she sinks into the depth of the abyss, but then finds a whole new world. I want to show you, I showed you the chart of when I booked my flight to Alaska. And because the myth is so strong in Arctic culture, it's actually important to track what's going on in Alaska. Isn't it interesting that just as Sedna moves into Gemini, we have Russia and America, Putin and Trump meeting, of all places, in Alaska, which used to be Russian territory. Isn't it interesting that just as she moved into Gemini, we have a lot of documents that are hidden in the depth of the ocean, the Epstein file, that everybody wants to have a look at because it can reveal something that's not so, ethical. So she is just starting her process of revealing and connecting worlds as she passes through Gemini. But I want to show you another example. This is the chart of a lady who grew up in the Middle East and Europe And she's born with Venus conjunct Sedna. And lo and behold, comes the day when she dates. She starts to look for a partner online, and she meets her future wife, who happens to be from Alaska. And the day they meet, the asteroid Juno, which has to do with marriage and relationships, is exactly on Sedna and Venus. So she meets her future wife as Juno, the asteroid of relationship, is on the degree of Sedna, which natally conjunct her relationship Venus. What are the odds? Not only that, she moves to Alaska. She leaves everything behind and actually starts a completely new life in this distant land. Think about how distant it is. Just the same way the orbit of Sedna takes us from the center of our world to somewhere far away, very foreign. I mean, Alaska is very far, even if you live in the United States. So imagine someone from the Middle East, how conceptually, culturally remote that is. And Sedna by transit is at 16 Taurus in her first house, which a first house is always a house where there's new development. And yet, it doesn't touch anything until we look at her progressions. And so that the inner wheel is her progress chart, and the moon was 17, her progress moon is 17 Taurus, right on the transiting Sedna at 16 Taurus. So it's not a coincidence. There's something about her meeting someone from that distant land that happens to be the Arctic, where Sedna's home is, that is activated with the moon, and her home is going to be Sedna's home. Now, who is her partner? Here is the chart of her partners who became her wife. Initially, she was born in the UK, but her family moved to Alaska when she was a child. So she was also drawn to Alaska by destiny. And look where Sedna is, on her south node of origin, where she's coming from, in her fourth house of origin, where her home is going to be. And by nature, she felt very connected to Alaska because she loves fishing and she loves the outdoors and she loves the Alaskan lifestyle. So both these charts capture, the myth and the interrelation with the land of Sedna through the planet Sedna. Now you may ask, is everyone born with Venus conjunct Sedna? Are they, destined to marry someone from the Arctic? Obviously not. But that's where we start our research. That's where we start to see how this works. And if you look at the history of Alaska, you will see Sedna. That's what I'm going to demonstrate also at the conference, is how she moves and activates stories for us and for her land. I've seen stories of drowning associated with immediate Sedna activations. So it's both, in this case, a very positive renewal in life, and there may be, similar feelings of drowning, both literally and figuratively. So that's the end of chapter 1 on Sedna. And I'm going to move now onto our next goddess, Eris. And there's a whole article on Eris, Haumea, on my website, right? So if you want to expand on that. So Eris is pretty far out, but not as much as Sedna. She's a 550 something year cycle. Her nodes are 6 Taurus and Scorpio. And she stays a different amount of years in each sign because her orbit is not as circular, it's more elliptical. So she was in Pisces for 77 years and moved into Pisces exactly during the Irish famine, 1845, which led to a migration. But famine, just like slavery, is related to Pisces because it has to do with the world of nature, and with the fact that there's, some kind of mass effacement, people losing themselves, losing their identity. So the failing crops lead to a migration and lead to, obviously, devastation. When Eris moved into Aries is when the Soviet Union was created, which was a very autocratic leadership. And then Mussolini rose to power. So that year, you had, very aggressive male energy that caused discord and abuse of power. So I want to go back to the myth. Who is Eris? Eris is a Greco-Roman goddess, and she is so intense, a wild card, a loose cannon, that no one wants her around, and she's not invited to the party. And that's part of the important, I would say, catchphrase, archetype. Who is not invited to the party, and for what reason? So Eris invites herself, and you have all the other gods of the Greek pantheon, the Aphrodites and Athena, and all these other beautiful goddesses who everybody looks up to, who are present. And as Eris shows up, everybody's like, oh my God, what now? What's going to happen next? And indeed, she challenges them. She throws the apple of discord. So imagine this very graceful ladies can, not all of them are soft. Aphrodite is more of the softer side, but Athena is a warrior. And so, but they're both in their power. And Eris comes and throws the apples of discord and challenges them to see who is the fairest among them, which basically creates tension and creates discord. And suddenly they start, they're pitted against each other and they start fighting. And Paris has to decide who is indeed the fairest. And so Hera, which is Juno, offers to Paris power and kingship all over Asia. And Athena, who is a warrior and wise counsel. She offers wisdom and skill in war, making him an unbeatable warrior. And Aphrodite, being Venus, doing what she knows best, offers him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta. And Paris, being who Paris is, chooses love and romance and beauty. And so Aphrodite wins this kind of contest. But as a result of that, he starts the Trojan War in order to have Helen. And so once again, Eris is responsible for war. But what is important to retain is that she exposes all these otherwise composed and powerful people, powerful deities, in an unflattering light. It shows the cracks in their moral character, in their grace and decency. And you will find Eris in many astrological circumstances where she's going to defy the sacred cows, what you hold as immaculate, as perfect, as when you think you're above it all, or when you think someone else is above it all, Eris comes and exposes something that is inconvenient, the inconvenient truth. Sounds familiar? So, interestingly, Eris is very instrumental if you look at the astrology of Black Lives Matter and decolonization. So that is a whole thing to unpack. But she's also very present in the Me Too movement, which I'm going to show you here very briefly. So on October 5th, 2017, this infamous article is published where it exposes the Hollywood patriarch producer, pretty much unbeatable, pretty much above, above defeat, so it seemed. And so he is revealed in this article to have abused his power and to have manipulated women for sexual favors in return for roles in movies. And many women wanted to expose him, and he had to pay to silence them. And so finally, this article comes out and reveals what went on. And this creates a chain reaction where other people in position of power, essentially men, are exposed in this abuse of power. And so this happens on a new moon in Libra Aries, which is all about relationships and men-women polarities. But for Alyssa Milano, this full moon is right on her natal Eris Chiron. So Chiron adds another layer of, fall from grace. And she borrows this concept of Me Too from Tarana Burki to encourage women to basically speak up and share, their own story, or at least show an alliance that they too, endured abuse, and see how prevalent the abuses. So Tarana introduced the Me Too concept in 2006. But Elisa Milano used the hashtag. And this is kind of what led to the viral moment where everyone using the internet and social media created a whole revolution to empower the disenfranchised. Again, those who are taken for granted, those who are silenced by the big, powerful, patriarchal leaders who feel entitled. And so the myth of Eris is a myth of inconvenient truth. And sometimes Eris can be just destructive for the sake of destructive. And there's something that is, like I said, it's a wild card. But most of the time, the controversy, the strife, is because there's something very truthful that people are trying to suppress. And Eris is kind of liberating in that sense, revealing the inconvenient truth. And so it happened during her own discovery. Listen to this. When Eris was discovered, she was not the first of these bodies, but astronomers thought that she was the largest of these bodies, bigger than Pluto. And so they started to really question whether Pluto belongs to this other ecosystem, where you have gas giants and rocky planets. And Pluto doesn't have that constitution, doesn't behave the same way. It seems odd to include Pluto in the same category as the other planets. And if Eris is so big, are there more of these Pluto-type planets lurking in the Kuiper belt? So they understood that unless we're going to have 100 planets, we need to create another category. And so they reclassified Pluto as a dwarf planet, thanks to Eris. And guess what? As soon as that was voted on, and there's a chart for that, which I'm not going to show here, I think it's in the article. But as soon as they actually changed everything and reclassified Pluto, they found out that Eris was not bigger than Pluto after all. She has stronger mass, but she's not in diameter larger. So, she had that last laugh. And Pluto ended up being reinvented in that sense, which again, for us astrologers, it doesn't change much at all in the interpretation. But it does open the door to this new category of bodies, and it puts order in a place that was very undefined and misunderstood. So Eris, in some ways, created strife again, because there were huge debates, and people were still trying to keep Pluto as a regular planet. But in many ways, she was right, because it is a new world out there, and Pluto is actually a doorway to these other bodies. And that's not a lesser role, it's not about demoting, it's actually telling it like it is, disrupting, this kind of order. So pay attention to Eris in that context. She's a slow mover, but she does her job. So she's still now in the sign of Eris. So during the conference, I'm going to bring more examples and bring it to the current context as well. And there it is for Eris, closing that chapter and speaking now about Haumea. Haumea has a 284-year cycle. So she's getting closer to us, closer to Pluto. 26 to 33 years in a sign, and don't quote me on the exact, but that's a rough estimate. Her symbol is very interesting, looks like a temple. And she is the Hawaiian mother goddess of, mother of the pantheon, mother of Pele, who is the volcano goddess. So she is a fertility goddess. But if you think about Hawaii and the lava, it is the newest land on Earth, because as the lava flows and spills into the ocean, this chemical reaction leads the lava to solidify into rock. So the fire touches the water and becomes earth. But in its way, it kills everything. It burns everything. So it's scorched earth policy. And then there's new earth that looks horrible, so to speak. Barren, it's like a Mordor dark lava. And suddenly the trees are starting to come out. There are some trees that are managing to crack the lava, the ohias, and feed from its minerals. And they give way to more ohias and to more trees and palm trees. And eventually, this barren, seemingly barren ground turns into a forest. So as much as Haumea is a creation and fertility goddess, there's a lot of destruction. It's very primal. If you live in Hawaii, if you spend time in Hawaii, you are seeing the beginning of time. This is how it all started. And it's pretty intense and chaotic. Now, it's interesting again that in indigenous cultures, nature is conscious, is understood to be conscious. Trees are not just things. They are alive and they are conscious and they participate in the global evolution. Not only are trees, not only are animals conscious, but even natural phenomena, mountains, forests, lava. Lava is not just fire randomly going. It has intelligence and consciousness. And I'm going to share this story that you may have heard before, but there are many stories in Hawaii where the volcano was burning everything in its path and was threatening towns and villages. And there was a story of a woman who went, evacuated her home because the lava was coming. And she went back because she needed something. She forgot something. And the lava was suddenly close by. And she prayed and prayed, on her knees to be spared and to spare her home. And that's what happened. The lava went around her house and did not take her house down. And to this day, this house is kind of a gathering place on the Big Island. The same thing happened when I was living there. In 2014, the lava was again coming to the village of Pahoa. And there, it was slow enough that we had time to put things in storage and to prepare for evacuation. And then, the day was coming. The lava was getting closer and it would cross the highway, which means it would separate that part of the island, that village, from the rest of the island, cut supplies, and make it very difficult to be there. And people were preparing, and there was a calendar, she's going to probably cross on that day. She, not just it, but she. And the children prayed. And they gave offerings to Pele and the whole pantheon, and Haumea, of course. And the lava stopped a few meters from the highway. And everything went back to normal. There are more stories like that. And the reason why the lava was coming to town was a warning, because they were abusing nature. There were circumstances where there was some disrespect. And so she stopped short of as a warning. However, 3 to 4 years later, in 2018, she came without a warning. For most. And she came not on the surface coming down, she came from under tunnel and broke everything open in that same town. Because the warning was not heeded. So when we speak of Haumea and scorched earth policy, as well as rebirth and fertility, it's a mixed bag. It's a complex and layered experience. So when you see that right now, Haumea moved into Scorpio, when? October 2023. That's when we have the October 7 attack between Palestinians and Israelis, which is one of the most vicious conflict in the history of the region. So there were a lot of hostilities along the years, but this took a very dramatic turn where the harming of civilians on both sides, starting with the Hamas attack on families and elderly and peace activists that were shot and brutalized. And then the hostages kidnapped. Something that was deeply wounded innocence. And then the retaliation that was very much, that is still going on, and is very much a scorched earth mindset of eradicating pretty much Gaza. And this kind of complete destruction, not only of the sign of Scorpio, but how Haumea can act. It doesn't have to act like that, but it can act very radically. And the way it looks now, it's just like a volcano feel. It's like Mordor again. And we're waiting for the trees to sprout, for the palm trees to sprout. and for the renewal to come, perhaps in a new state. Perhaps, as much as everything seems broken, and so it seems after a volcanic eruption, will there be civilization again? Will there be life again? We can pray. So Haumea is a fertility goddess. She is powerful, but she is also radical in that scorched earth. And that's part of what, interestingly, Lynn Bell is going to speak about at the event, is the light and the dark feminine, which is not necessarily about the dwarf planets as a concept, the polarity, which I find fascinating. So this is going to be our opening lecture. The state of Hawaii was declared in 1959 when the sun and Haumea were exactly conjunct. That's in the article that's on my website. What are the odds? That tells you how relevant they are. Closing this chapter, and the last one is Quaoar, that I want to touch on. And Quaoar is also a fertility deity of the Native American of South California, Los Angeles, San Diego area and basin. Now, Quaoar create the world through song and dance. And Quaoar came to Earth and saw how chaotic it was, how much it was in disarray. And he started to make his dance and created new gods who in turn manifested life. So it's not scorched earth, but it's through motion and grace and movement. But there's always, where you see Quaoar, you see chaos, mayhem, disarray that needs to be restored into order. So he brings the law. So there's something quite Saturnian about bringing back structure, bringing back the laws. There are two symbols of Quaoar. One of them is this square with this spike, and the other one is here, represented in this new moon. So I mentioned how Quaoar relates to the area of Los Angeles. And what happened earlier this year when there was an exact new moon on Quaoar, now 9 degrees Capricorn. A week later, the massive fire, very aggressive, took down a whole area of Los Angeles, the Palisades and other neighborhoods. Was devastating. And it happened just as Quaoar was on that full new moon. It was also the time of Mars retrograde opposing Pluto. But it's interesting that this fire, and think about the symbolism of California, and then Trump coming into power for his second term soon after. And Quaoar is in the sign of Capricorn, bringing chaos and disarray and controversy to the institution, to the leadership of the world. And Trump is known to be a disruptor, to bring mayhem and chaos. For better and worse, he's revisiting everything. He is challenging all the agreements that were made. And some of them needed to be revisited. Some of them were archaic. Unfortunately, his way of handling things is completely, it's kind of a war on compassion. He doesn't seem to be able to have that element. But in his disruption, there is a lot that is being rewritten. And it has a very strong Quaoar flavor in the sign of Capricorn. And it's interesting that as Trump is kind of dominating Washington, even now through military, the one figure who is showing up as one of the most defiant figure to Trump is actually the California governor Newsom, standing up to him and threatening not to pay for California not to pay federal taxes. So there's some kind of separatism that starts to happen, which is another discussion. But is it a coincidence that Gavin Newsom, who is the governor of that area where Quaoar is home to, has Quaoar on his own south node? So he's getting some kind of backing. That's part of his own origin story. South node is where we're coming from. And, in this time, with the fires and the polarization between California and the Trump administration happens with these symbols. So you see how we get into layers and how things are revealed once we start piecing those pieces of the puzzle, putting them together. We start to see a narrative, a script that, we can get to a lot of information by looking at the natal chart. Gavin has Pluto-Mars square right on his angle. So he needs a villain. He needs a nemesis. He's someone who is here to fight, really. But then the Quaoar function and how that interacts with Trump gives a completely new dimension to this. To be continued. One more deity that I would like to kind of bring to your awareness, and I'm still researching, it's Gonggong from China. Has a beautiful, very squarish symbol with waves. I love this kind of dichotomy of soft versus angular. And so it is that Gonggong is a sea deity. He rules the sea, similar to Sedna. However, he's a redhead and fiery. So there's this combination of fire and water, which are usually not mixing. But Gonggong is doing his own magic. So pay attention. We'll explore more of that. It's one of the more recent, discovered in 2007. So I invite you to learn more. If you understand how valuable astrology is, if you resonate with this kind of soul-centered and how we can go to the depth of our psyche on a personal level and on the level of the collective civilization, I invite you to consider joining our educational program. And cycle 15 is beginning end of 2025. So check the website and you will see under Learn Astrology, there are different tracks you can follow. And it covers everything from A to Z, but from an evolutionary, soul-centered point of view, deep knowledge. It's a commitment, and yet it will transform your life, because this is not just helping others. It is your own revelation. It will crack you open. On this note, many blessings. Until next time.